Over the past few weeks, we've been looking at first century Christianity, and just to give a very, very brief recap of that. Last week I talked about how, even the whole idea of Jesus's death and resurrection was something that was new and different to the understanding of the Jewish people of the time, to the disciples of Jesus. They didn't quite understand that that's what the Messiah was going to come and do. He wasn't going to come and conquer the Roman Empire and kick them out of the land of Israel and restore the kingdom of Israel. Instead, he was going to show, what he showed through his faithful and humble death on the cross, that was the proper way to submit to God. And there would be victory through that kind of way of living and dying. But then, after the resurrection and the church, so to speak, was growing and was thriving, there was the issue of whether or not non-Jewish people could be a part of the faith. And we're so glad that they made the decision that, yes, non-Jewish people can be a part of the faith, and we don't have to become Jewish. We don't have to adopt Jewish law upon ourselves and become Jewish. We can be who we are, wherever you're from in the world, and you can be a Christian, you can be somebody who is a worshiper of God, a follower of Jesus, as you are, and that's a wonderful thing. Our sin is enough to repent of our sin. That's what is necessary. You don't have to take any extra steps in order to become a part of the family of God. But then we also looked at the fact that Jesus and the disciples foresaw and foretold of the coming destruction that was going to come upon Jerusalem and the temple. And that brings us to where we are now in this series. And in fact, I sort of rushed through a lot of that last week, and that's why I'm perfectly okay with sort of repeating a few things from last week, getting us back to the 60s of the first century. What an important decade that was in the history of our faith. At the time, the emperor of the Roman Empire was Nero. And Nero reigned from 54 to 68. And he hated Christians. He was a very sinful, depraved man. And he hated Christians. He called what we believed in a hateful superstition. That's what he called the Christian faith, a hateful superstition. In fact, the Roman historian Tacitus reported that a I can never say that word, mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea. He's talking about how this superstition, our faith, broke out in the land of Israel and Judea, but then it spread all the way to Rome as well. But even in Rome, he said. And so when a great fire broke out in 64, the year 64, many historians say that Nero probably was the cause of the fire, and so he wanted to pass the blame off to somebody else, and so he blamed Christians, the followers of Jesus, who were in the city, and this led to a great persecution of Christians. This is, again, the first time that Christians were persecuted by the Roman Empire to this degree of severity. They were killed and thrown to the lions and the Colosseum and so on. And in fact, by Nero's own order, the apostles Peter and Paul, who were both in the city at the time, were killed during this persecution. And so you can blame Nero for the deaths of Peter, one of Jesus's main disciples and the founder of many of the churches in the Roman Empire, including the Roman church, the church in Rome, and Paul, who is the one who took the gospel out to the Gentile world and established churches all throughout the world, and we read his letters to this day, and I revere him, we revere him, right? We can thank Nero that he is the one responsible for their brutal deaths. And so I would call this a satanic persecution of Christians, because that's what Scripture says. In fact, the book of Revelation refers to, in my opinion at least, I could be wrong, but I think that the beast of the book of Revelation is a reference to the Roman Empire and to Nero in particular. But it says that the dragon, who is identified as Satan, so Satan, the dragon, gave the beast, that is Nero, his own power and throne and great authority. So to whatever degree that Satan has power and authority, and we can understand that as the power and authority of the rulers of this world, the governments of this world, the Roman Empire, the spiritual power that is empowering those institutions, and in fact the Roman Empire itself, is of satanic origin. And so you can imagine that Nero was not somebody that Christians looked to with any kind of favor, or they didn't look, they were calling him the beast who was empowered by Satan. They didn't like Nero. But then back in Jerusalem in the mid-60s, some of the Jewish people, the more zealous Jewish people, the ones who wanted to have back their own sovereignty over their land, they initiated what is called the First Jewish Revolt. They revolted against the Roman Empire, and they took back the land of Israel. However, Nero sent a general named Vespasian to stop the revolt. And the book of Revelation says the beast was allowed to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And he was given authority to rule over every tribe and people and language and nation. This began the Jewish-Roman War of the late 60s of the first century. The Jewish-Roman War, I think, is what, at least partly what the book of Revelation is talking about when it talks about all the death and destruction that came upon the land. That is, when the Roman Empire, with Vespasian as the general, came into the land of Israel, and from the north in Galilee, going all the way into Judea, they overtook the land of Israel, and in 70 AD destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and destroyed, and caused death and destruction to occur there. However, according to Eusebius, we are told that the church, the Jerusalem church, the church that James, the brother of Jesus, was the head of, at least earlier in the decade, they were told by a prophetic oracle to leave Jerusalem and go to an area named Pella. And this I also see in the book of Revelation. It says that the woman, which I think is the Jerusalem church, fled into the wilderness where God had prepared a place for her for 1,260 days. When that occurred, Vespasian later became the emperor. Nero died in 68, and Vespasian, who was leading the war against the Jewish people, then became the emperor. There was other emperors for a few short months in between. I'm going to be doing that a lot, by the way. I'm going to be skipping over some of the Roman... There's so many Roman emperors between Nero and Constantine. There's no way I can mention them all, and some of them are not very relevant to our discussion. But the point is that Vespasian became the emperor of Rome, and his son Titus finished the job and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And so Titus is the one who is leading the charge for the Romans to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And as a result of the devastation of that war, now the Jerusalem church was no longer located in Jerusalem. They were in the area of Pella in the land of Israel. And they had no great influence any longer because they were basically, hiding from the Roman Empire. So as a result of our faith no longer having Jerusalem as the center of our faith, the mother church wasn't there anymore in Jerusalem. So the center of Christianity moved west and north to Antioch, where there was an already established church, and then south to Egypt and Alexandria, there was an established church there, and then west in Rome. These became the three big churches of Christianity after the Jerusalem church was scattered. The church in Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. Rome had not yet taken on the status, the Roman church had not yet taken on the status that it would later take on in Catholic Christianity as being the mother church. But it was becoming an important church, of course. And as a result, in the decades that followed, now you had the Roman Empire. Christians were on the radar, so to speak, of the Roman Empire and Roman emperors. And so now we have, I'm not going to get all these names right, Domitian, I believe, he persecuted Christians at the end of the century, at the end of the first century, and he, again, did so in order to maintain, as any emperor needs to do, like he needs to maintain his power and authority, and so he persecuted Christians. Then there's Trajan, and this is in the early part of the second century. He wanted to deal with Christians in his province because he indicated that Christianity had become a significant enough presence in order to draw the attention of the Roman Empire. In other words, they were having such a powerful effect. And let me remind us why this mattered to the Romans. If you were a Christian in the Roman Empire, that means you were saying no to the Roman religion, the religion of the gods of the Roman pantheon, like Jupiter and so on. These are the names of our planets, but it comes from the Roman religion. And so if you became a Christian, you were saying no to that religion, and in fact, you were seen by many people to be turning your back upon the Roman Empire by becoming a Christian. You were saying that this Jesus guy, he is the true king, not the emperor. And so Christianity was growing so much in the empire that it caused even the emperors like Domitian and Trajan here to take notice and to persecute Christians as a result. But sadly, this continued with Marcus Aurelius in the second half of the second century. He wanted, again, to maintain traditional Roman religious practices. He didn't like that Christianity was challenging that, and so he persecuted Christians as well. And then we have in the third century, mid-third century there, Decius, and he initiated a widespread persecution of Christians. Look at this. He required all Roman citizens to perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods or face punishment. So if you were a Roman citizen who was a Christian, you had to sacrifice to the Roman gods, otherwise you would be punished. So there was no kind of religious tolerance going on here in the Roman Empire in the third, even by the third century. And then at the end of the third century, Diocletian, he initiated the last and most severe persecution of Christians, and it lasted all the way from the end of the third century into the fourth century, 311 AD is when it stopped. And so there's no doubt in my mind that Christians who lived throughout these centuries, they would open up the New Testament, open up the writings of the apostles, and they would want to see encouragement coming from them about what to do when being persecuted, because the apostles themselves and the Christians of the first century were persecuted. And so they would read, for example, in 1 Peter, Peter said, "Don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the world." And so, Peter, taking what Peter was saying here, they would understand that when we suffer, when Christians are persecuted and suffer for being Christians, this is something that we should rejoice in, not because it's fun to go through, but because we get to experience the suffering that Jesus experienced, right? We get to identify with Jesus and say, obviously if he went through it, we can go through it. And if he can come out the other side with the resurrection, we will come out the other side with resurrection life as well. And so there's something to hold on to. There's the hope that we can hold on to whenever we face persecution. Now, we who live here in 21st century Canada, the kinds of persecution that Christians go through is very minimal compared to what the Christians of this time had to go through, right? Yeah, sometimes we don't like what people say or do about Christianity, but it's nothing compared to this. We have the freedom, thank God, to be able to be Christians and to worship the way we want to and to live the way we want to. And that's the way it should be. And this is what I'm going to basically argue for in this sermon, at the end of this sermon, is the more Christianity had to adapt because of all this persecution and to survive, I guess, they got into bed with the state. They got into bed with the Roman Empire. They merged with the Roman Empire by the 4th century. We'll look at this in a minute. But what that causes and what that resulted in is no longer having the kind of freedom that we would want to have in order to be able to go deeper in our faith. We'll get to that in a second. On the one hand, you don't want to be persecuted, but on the other hand, you don't want to join the beast, right? You don't want to become partners with the beast either. There's got to be a better way than either of those things. The other main thing I want to talk about, there's actually 4 total things that I want to talk about today, but the other main thing, there was firstly persecution occurred between the years between Nero and Constantine. You could say that persecution basically was the main thing that happened to Christians. But the other major thing that happened to Christians or involved Christians was the fact that Christianity was splitting from Judaism. I've tried to come up with maybe a better verb there. Divorced from Judaism. I don't know. The point is this, is that in the 1st century, the original Christian movement was Jewish because Jesus is Jewish and the apostles were Jewish. And when they became followers of Jesus, they didn't stop being Jewish or even practicing Judaism. They just understood that Jesus was the Messiah and that their faith was now in him, but it didn't take on a wholly different character. It was still the Jewish faith as they had known it. But again, as I mentioned earlier, as we looked at last week, when non-Jewish people came into the faith, they allowed them to remain not Jewish and to not have to become Jewish. But this sort of started the process to allow there to be a split between Christians and Jews. But that's not the only thing that happened. The next thing that happened is that the Jerusalem church, and we're sort of jumping back now, let's say before the Jewish-Roman War, in the early part of the 60s, we are told, according to historians, that the Jerusalem church was banned from being able to meet in the temple courts. Now, what is this referring to? Well, there's a part of the temple courts, you can just imagine a big square or big rectangle, and part of the courts, the outer courts, there was a place called Solomon's Colonnade. And this is, in fact, where Jesus would often walk through and he would teach people. So there's a reference in John chapter 10, verse 23 of Jesus walking through Solomon's Colonnade and teaching people there. But it says in Acts chapter 5, verse 12, that all the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade. So this was the main area that Christians would meet. The Jewish Christians would meet there, would pray together, would worship together, would do teaching there. It was basically like, yeah, we can meet in homes or we can meet in synagogues, but let's have one big assembly. This is where the word church came from, actually. Let's have one big assembly of Christians so that we can have our time together. But now in the, let's say, the mid-60s of the first century, Jewish Christians were banned from being able to congregate there. In fact, I think that the book of Hebrews was written to those Christians, to those Jewish Christians, to encourage them, after being banned, that it's okay. You can continue to have your faith. Even though you're not allowed to go to the temple, you can still have your faith. And that's a lot of what the book of Hebrews is talking about, is the fact that the faith can continue on. In fact, we are a part of the new covenant, which doesn't even include the temple and the animal sacrifices. And in fact, in my opinion, I think the book of Revelation was written to encourage believers after the temple was destroyed. right? In order to encourage them about the fact that the faith would continue on. But we'll get into that another time. So they were banned from the temple courts, and as a result of the Jewish war with the Romans, guess what? If you were Jewish, you were now enemies of the state. Now here's the thing about Jewish Christians. They didn't want to be at war with the Romans. Jesus never taught us to raise up an army and fight against the Romans, right? What did Jesus teach us? What did Jesus teach his Jewish disciples? He taught them, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword, right? Put your swords away. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, right? So Jesus didn't want his disciples to be at war, and so when it came time to be at war with the Romans, the Jewish Christians didn't participate. But guess what that meant? On the Roman side, they're not going to make a distinction. If you're Jewish, you're Jewish. Doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. If you're Jewish, you're an enemy of the state. So now, imagine yourself as a Jewish Christian living in the 60s, late 60s in Jerusalem. Your nation, the Jewish nation, is at war with the Roman Empire. So you are now being persecuted by the Roman Empire simply for being Jewish, right? But then on the Jewish side, the people who did want to go to war with the Romans, they're angry at you because you're not participating in the war. You're getting it from both sides, right? The Romans are angry with you simply because you're Jewish, and other Jewish people are angry with you simply because you are not participating. So, you really had nowhere to go, right? If you were a Jewish Christian in the first century living in that area, or even throughout the empire, really. And it only gets worse because later in the century, in the first century, the rest of Judaism got together and said, we're going to continue on, even though there's no temple anymore, we're going to continue to be Jewish and have Judaism, and we're going to make our prayers very important. So if you know anything about Judaism, then you know that Jewish people pray, Orthodox Jewish people pray 3 times a day, and they have 18 different prayers that they pray in those prayer times every day. Well, at the end of the first century, towards the end of the first century, a 19th prayer was added. And get this, it was a prayer that cursed Christians. And so it basically is calling upon God to curse anybody who is a Christian or who is part of a heretical sect. I think we would do well to maybe look into this some other time to really understand what happened here. But if you were a Jewish Christian and you were used to praying these prayers, and now suddenly there was a 19th prayer and it cursed Christians, you weren't going to pray that. And if you weren't praying that, the rest of your Jewish brothers and sisters would get angry with you. Well, aren't you Jewish? What's wrong with you? Right? And so there was a reason why Jewish people and other Christians stopped attending the synagogue and being a part of the Jewish community. And it also gets even worse, because then there was a Jewish tax. The Roman Empire said, if you are Jewish, you have to pay a certain tax to the Roman Empire. And guess what? They didn't care whether or not you were actually Jewish. As long as you looked Jewish or associated with Jewish people, you got the tax. And so now, if you're not Jewish and you're a Christian, you have every reason to start distancing yourselves from the Jewish people. Because not only are they the enemy of the state, now they have this tax, and at the same time, they're cursing you in their prayers, and so you had every reason to start distancing yourself from Judaism and the Jewish people, right? And then they would look at what the apostles wrote about how Jesus brought the new covenant, about how we looked at some of these verses last week, about how what is old and passing away, the old covenant was old and passing away and becoming obsolete. And so people in the 2nd century, Christians in the 2nd century, would look at that and would say, well, I guess God was moving on to us, right? In reality, the apostles were saying that God was now focusing on the remnant of Israel, those within Israel who were faithful, but the Jewish people who continued on as Christians, or rather the non-Jewish people who were Christians in the 2nd century, they didn't quite understand that what the apostles were teaching, that it didn't mean that God was moving on to new people. And so they started to see that there really is a break between Judaism and Christianity. Okay. I kind of feel like these historical sermons are too much to go through. It's too much to really absorb. And maybe next week I'll focus on Mother's Day and we'll take a little break from this sort of thing. But there's just welcome to my week this past week, because I did so much reading this week and got overwhelmed with just how much happened between the 60s of the 1st century and the 4th century when Constantine became emperor. So we'll conclude with this, okay? There was plenty of division among Christians, and lots of different reasons why there was division, but some of the reasons why people argued with one another as Christians was there was lots of arguments about whether or not Jesus was divine, right? Lots of people said, no, he was a human being who was appointed by God, and, kind of like what we believe. But then a lot of Christians were saying, no, Jesus is in some way God, or he is one with the Father, and that means something more than just being one in purpose. Then there were also all kinds of arguments about the observance of the law, whether or not you should keep the Sabbath, whether or not you should keep Passover. These became big arguments and divisions. And so by the time we get to the 4th century, there was a need for somebody to come in and say, hey, we need to settle this once and for all. And it just so happened to be the person who became emperor in 306 of the 4th century there, a man named Constantine. He became the emperor, and according to Eusebius, the historian, Constantine had to fight a series of battles in order to become the emperor. And in one of these battles, before the battle, he saw a vision of a cross, and he saw the words which translated means, in this sign you will conquer. And so he saw a cross which was associated with Jesus, and he was told, I guess, in this sign you will conquer. And so he believed that this was a sign from God, and he ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shields. And through those circumstances, Constantine was given the victory, I guess, and became the emperor of Rome, and in fact began to become a Christian, converted to Christianity. In 313, as emperor, he made Christianity legal. It didn't become the religion of the Roman Empire yet, but it became legal. So suddenly now you could be a Christian in the Roman Empire and not be persecuted. So this was a real radical shift from the past 300 years that had just passed. And in fact, Constantine wanted there to be unity among Christians. And so the division I just talked about, he said, why don't we have a council, right? Let's get all the bishops together. Bishops means overseers. Let's get all the overseers of the churches together from all around the empire. Let's meet in one location and have a big debate about these issues that are dividing us, and let's settle the debates once and for all. And that's the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. We're not going to get to that today. Because from that point forward, if you were not a believer in Jesus being divine, or if you were somebody who wanted to keep Passover, you were now considered a heretic, right? And this is all because Constantine had declared, we want unity. It wasn't because Constantine, these issues had already existed for decades, but he was the one who said, we're going to put an end to this right here, and we're going to make one side of these arguments orthodox, and the one that has continued to this day. So, I want to ask these questions. as a result of getting to this point where now, instead of the emperor of Rome being the main persecutor of the church, remember, they called Nero the beast. He was the one responsible for their deaths, for destruction, right? And that continued on for many emperors in those 300 years. But now we've gotten to an emperor, Constantine, who was now the one who was allowing Christianity to be kept, and in fact was guiding it to become unified. So was this good or bad for the faith? Certainly it's an adaptation. By getting to this point of saying, well, we want to be on the side of the Roman Empire, we want the Roman Empire to be on our side. And so we're going to go along with this Constantine and go along with what he's telling us. Was this good or was this bad? Right? I'll give you my thoughts here. I think this was a terrible thing. To marry the state, to become one with the Roman Empire meant at this, and I get it. I know why they did it. Who wants to be persecuted and killed? I get it. But by marrying the state in this way, gone now was the ability to be free to think. Gone now was the ability to discuss and debate and question and to go back to what the scripture says and try to understand what Jesus taught and what the apostles taught. Now, the bishops and the emperor, they could decide for you. Who wants to think? Nobody wants to think, and so we can just have people think for us. But this is not what Jesus and the apostles wanted us to do. And this is why Paul said, don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So yeah, I get it. We don't want to be persecuted because that isn't healthy for us either, but to be married to the state and to have such a institutionalized and Romanized version of our faith is not good either, because that erases the ability to be able to discover what Jesus and the apostles actually taught and to be free to pursue that. And so I am grateful, and those who believe in tradition or are Catholic would disagree with me here, but I'm so grateful that we've had the Protestant Reformation. We've had such progress to get us to this point now in the 21st century where we do have the freedom to question things. We do have the freedom to say, hey, I don't know if that's what Jesus and the apostles actually taught or believed. Let's go back to the scripture. Let's try to understand it in its original context, right? Let's sing Cornerstone. Let's make Jesus the Messiah, Christ, our cornerstone, not anything else. And I'm not saying this in order to step on toes, but Jesus alone needs to be our king, right? Jesus alone, because he is the only one that gives us the freedom to pursue truth and wisdom.